The words hit me like a slap across the face at the Thanksgiving dinner table. "You're absolutely worthless, Lauren. I don't know what my son ever saw in you." Patricia Coleman's voice dripped with venom as she carved the turkey, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the silver knife. The entire family sat in stunned silence. 23 people gathered around that massive mahogany table in what they all believed was her grand colonial home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But as I looked around at their shocked faces, a slow smile spread across my lips. Because Patricia Coleman had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She had no idea that the woman she'd just called worthless actually owned every single brick, every polished floorboard, every crystal chandelier hanging above her head. The house she'd been lording over the family for 15 years? Mine. The trust fund she bragged about? Empty. The empire she claimed to have built? A lie. And in exactly 60 seconds, I was going to prove it to everyone at that table. My name is Lauren Hayes, though for the past 8 years it's been Lauren Coleman, and until this morning I thought that meant something. I thought it meant I belonged somewhere, had found my place in the world. Looking back now, I can see how naive that was. But 8 years ago, when I first met David Coleman at a real estate conference in Hartford, I truly believed I'd found my person. I was 26 then, fresh off a string of successful property flips in Portland, Oregon, where I'd grown up. My father had been a carpenter, my mother a school administrator, and they'd taught me the value of hard work and smart investments. After college, I'd scraped together enough money to buy my first rundown duplex, renovated it myself with skills my dad had taught me, and sold it for twice what I'd paid. Within 3 years, I'd built a small but profitable real estate investment business, specializing in undervalued commercial properties that I could transform into profitable ventures. The Hartford conference was my first time venturing into the East Coast market. I'd heard there were opportunities in Connecticut's struggling small cities, abandoned factories and warehouses that could be converted into profitable mixed-use developments. I was presenting my portfolio to a group of potential investors when I first saw David. He was tall, probably 6'2", with sandy brown hair that looked like he'd just stepped out of a magazine. His navy suit was perfectly tailored, his smile confident in the way that only comes from a lifetime of privilege. But what struck me most was how intently he listened to my presentation, asking thoughtful questions about zoning laws and renovation costs, while the other suits in the room seemed more interested in their phones. After my presentation, he approached me directly. "Lauren Hayes," he said, extending his hand. "I'm David Coleman. That was impressive. I've been looking for someone with your kind of vision to partner with on some family properties." The Coleman name meant something in Connecticut. I'd done my research before the conference and knew they owned significant commercial real estate throughout the state, passed down through 3 generations of savvy investors. David explained that his family was looking to modernize their approach, bring in fresh ideas for properties that had been sitting stagnant for years. We spent 3 hours at the hotel bar that night, talking about everything from market trends to renovation techniques. He was knowledgeable, charming, and genuinely interested in my background and ideas. Our professional relationship began immediately. David connected me with several properties in his family's portfolio, and I began developing renovation plans that could maximize their potential. A defunct textile mill in Waterbury that I envisioned as artists, lofts. A shuttered department store in New Britain that could become a community marketplace. Each project I proposed showed significant profit potential, and David was enthusiastic about moving forward. The personal relationship developed more slowly. David was careful, methodical in the way he approached everything. He'd invite me to dinner to discuss business. Then gradually the conversations would drift to personal topics. He told me about growing up in Riverside, about the pressure of living up to family expectations, about his dreams of expanding the Coleman real estate empire beyond Connecticut. I shared stories about my childhood in Portland, about learning to swing a hammer before I could properly tie my shoes, about the satisfaction of transforming something broken into something beautiful. 6 months after we met, David finally asked me out on a proper date, not a business dinner. We drove to Mystic Seaport, spent the day walking among the historic ships, and talking about everything except real estate. That evening, as we sat on the deck of a waterfront restaurant watching the sunset paint the harbor gold, he took my hand and said, "Lauren, I think I'm falling in love with you." I should have known then that something was off. Not because of his words, but because of the way he looked over his shoulder before he said them, as if checking to make sure no one he knew was watching. But I was too caught up in the romance of the moment, too flattered that this sophisticated man from a prominent family was interested in me. Our courtship continued for another year. David would drive up to Portland to visit me, or I'd come down to Connecticut for long weekends. He showed me around Riverside, introduced me to his favorite restaurants and shops, but something always felt slightly performative about these visits. When we'd run into people he knew, there was a moment of hesitation before he'd introduce me, a careful calculation in his eyes. "This is Lauren," he'd say. "She's a real estate developer from Portland. Never my girlfriend, never the woman I'm in love with, just my name and profession, as if I were a business associate he happened to be dining with." The first time I met his family was during our engagement party, which should have been my second warning sign. David proposed on a beach in Maine during what I thought was a romantic weekend getaway. The ring was stunning, a vintage Art Deco piece that had belonged to his grandmother. I said yes without hesitation, overwhelmed with happiness and the promise of building a life together. But when we returned to Connecticut and David announced our engagement to his family, the reaction was decidedly lukewarm. Patricia Coleman, his mother, was a formidable woman in her early 60s, with silver hair swept into a perfect chignon, and the kind of bone structure that spoke of good breeding. She received the news with a tight smile and a comment about hoping I understood what I was getting myself into. Frank Coleman, David's father, was more welcoming but in a distant sort of way. He asked polite questions about my business, nodded approvingly at my answers, but I could sense he was evaluating me like a potential investment, rather than a future daughter-in-law. David's sister Melissa was openly skeptical, making comments about how different David and I were, how she hoped the distance between Portland and Connecticut wouldn't be a problem. His brother Ryan barely acknowledged me at all. The engagement party itself took place at the Coleman family estate on Maple Ridge Drive, a magnificent colonial home that had been in the family for generations, according to David. The house was everything I'd imagined old Connecticut money would look like, with its sweeping circular driveway, perfectly manicured gardens, and rooms filled with antique furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars. Patricia had hired caterers and a small orchestra, transforming the backyard into an elegant outdoor ballroom. I felt out of place from the moment I arrived. My cocktail dress, which had seemed perfect when I bought it in Portland, suddenly felt too simple among the designer gowns of the other guests. The conversation swirled around topics I knew nothing about: charitable galas and country club politics, and families whose names I'd never heard, but were apparently very important. When people asked about my background, their interest visibly waned when I mentioned growing up in Oregon and working in construction renovation. But David stayed by my side throughout the evening, introducing me with pride, including me in conversations, making sure I never felt abandoned among his family's friends. When Patricia gave a toast welcoming me to the family, her words were gracious, even if her tone was slightly forced. I convinced myself that any awkwardness was just the natural adjustment period of families getting to know each other. The wedding planning process should have been my third warning sign. Patricia had very strong opinions about everything, from the venue to the menu to the guest list. She wanted the ceremony at the family's historic church in Riverside, the reception at the country club where she'd been a member for 30 years, and a guest list that seemed to prioritize business connections over personal relationships. When I suggested including some of my college friends from Portland, she wrinkled her nose and asked if they'd be comfortable at such a formal affair. David played peacekeeper throughout the process, suggesting compromises that usually involved me giving up something I wanted in favor of his mother's preferences. The flowers I'd chosen were too casual, so we went with Patricia's traditional arrangements. The band I'd found was too contemporary, so we hired the classical ensemble she recommended. Even my wedding dress became a source of tension when Patricia suggested I might want something more traditional than the modern design I'd fallen in love with. I told myself this was normal, that all families had their traditions and expectations. David assured me that once we were married, once I was officially part of the family, things would settle down. His mother was just particular about how things were done, he explained. She meant well, even if it didn't always come across that way. The wedding itself was beautiful, I have to admit. The church was filled with flowers, the reception was elegant, and David looked handsome in his tailored tuxedo as we exchanged vows. But even on what should have been the happiest day of my life, I felt like I was playing a role in someone else's story. The photographer Patricia had hired seemed more interested in capturing shots of the prominent guests than candid moments between David and me. The menu featured foods I'd never eaten before, prepared in ways that seemed designed more to impress than to satisfy. Even my own family seemed slightly overwhelmed by the grandeur of it all. My parents, bless them, had flown out from Portland with several of my aunts and uncles. They looked uncomfortable in their formal wear, clearly trying their best to fit in among the Connecticut elite. During the reception, I watched my father attempting to make conversation with Frank Coleman about construction techniques, only to be politely dismissed when Frank realized my dad was talking about residential carpentry rather than commercial development. My mother spent most of the evening sitting quietly at our family's table, smiling politely when spoken to but clearly out of her element. After the wedding, David and I settled into married life in a beautiful condo in West Hartford that he'd purchased as a wedding gift for us. The space was modern and elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows and high-end finishes throughout. David insisted on furnishing it himself, selecting pieces that complemented his aesthetic rather than asking for my input. When I suggested adding some personal touches, family photos, or artwork I'd collected over the years, he gently redirected me toward items that would better suit the sophisticated image he wanted to maintain. Our business partnership continued to flourish even as our personal relationship began to show signs of strain. The projects I developed for the Coleman portfolio were performing exceptionally well, generating significant profits that impressed even Frank Coleman. I was gaining a reputation in Connecticut real estate circles as an innovative developer, with a knack for seeing potential in overlooked properties. But at family gatherings, my professional success was rarely acknowledged.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Instead, I was introduced as David's wife, as if my identity was entirely defined by my relationship to him. Patricia's treatment of me was particularly frustrating. She had a way of delivering criticism disguised as helpful advice, suggesting that I might want to consider updating my wardrobe for Connecticut social events, or recommending a salon that could help me achieve a more polished look. She questioned my decorating choices in the condo, my cooking abilities when David and I hosted family dinners, even my fitness routine when she noticed I'd gained a few pounds during our first year of marriage. The undermining was subtle but constant. At family gatherings, Patricia would tell stories about David's childhood that emphasized how different his upbringing had been from mine. She'd mention how much she missed his ex-girlfriend Catherine, who had come from a prominent Hartford family and understood the social expectations of their circle. She'd suggest activities for David and me that required knowledge or skills I didn't possess, then express surprise when I couldn't participate fully. David's response to these situations was always the same. He'd tell me privately that I was being too sensitive, that his mother meant well, even if she didn't always express herself tactfully. He'd remind me how different their world was from what I was used to, how I needed to give them time to adjust to having someone from a different background in the family. When I pointed out specific instances of dismissive behavior, he'd minimize them or provide alternative explanations that made me question my own perceptions. The worst part was how isolated I began to feel. My business was thriving, but it required long hours and frequent travel between project sites. The friends I'd made in Portland felt increasingly distant, both geographically and emotionally. I'd tried to connect with other women in Riverside, joining the book club at the local library and volunteering for community events, but the conversations always seemed to circle back to topics I couldn't contribute to meaningfully. These women had grown up together, attended the same schools, shared decades of history that I could never be part of. Even David seemed to be pulling away from me. He spent more time at the family office, working on projects he described vaguely when I asked about them. Our conversations became increasingly focused on logistics, rather than dreams or feelings. When I suggested we plan a vacation together, something that would give us time to reconnect away from family pressures, he'd point to his schedule and promise we'd get away soon. But soon never seemed to arrive. 2 years into our marriage, I discovered I was pregnant. The news filled me with a joy I hadn't felt in months, a sense that this child would finally give me a secure place in the Coleman family. David was thrilled, immediately calling his parents to share the news. Patricia's reaction was enthusiastic in a way I'd never experienced from her before. Suddenly I was invited to lunch dates, where she'd discuss baby names and nursery themes, included in shopping trips for maternity clothes. Welcomed into conversations about family traditions I'd be passing down to my child. But the pregnancy ended in a miscarriage at 12 weeks. The grief was devastating, made worse by the way Patricia's newfound warmth evaporated almost immediately. The lunch invitations stopped, the shopping trips were canceled, and I was once again relegated to the periphery of family gatherings. David threw himself into work with even more intensity, as if staying busy could help him avoid processing the loss we'd both experienced. That was when I began to notice the first signs that something was seriously wrong with the Coleman family's financial situation. David had always been vague about the family's investment strategies, but I'd assumed that was just his way of keeping business and personal life separate. However, when I started paying closer attention to conversations at family gatherings, I began to pick up on references to temporary setbacks and market adjustments that suggested deeper problems. My own business was doing well enough that I offered to help with any projects that might benefit from my expertise. Frank Coleman was surprisingly receptive to my suggestions, even asking me to take a closer look at several properties that had been underperforming for years. What I discovered when I examined the books was troubling. Properties that should have been generating steady rental income were sitting vacant. Maintenance costs were being deferred, to the point where some buildings were becoming uninhabitable. Insurance policies had lapsed on several commercial properties, leaving the family exposed to significant liability. When I presented my findings to David, he dismissed my concerns as overthinking. The family had been through difficult periods before, he assured me. They had resources I wasn't aware of, strategies that didn't require my input. But I could see the stress in his face, the way his jaw tightened when I asked specific questions about their financial planning. The truth became impossible to ignore when I received a call from Victoria Santis, my business partner back in Portland. She'd been approached by a private investigator asking questions about my financial situation, specifically whether I had access to significant liquid assets or investment capital. The inquiry had come through official channels, suggesting it was related to some kind of legal matter. When I confronted David about the investigation, he finally admitted what I'd already begun to suspect. The Coleman family was facing serious financial difficulties. Poor investment decisions over the past decade, combined with Frank's gambling problem and Patricia's expensive lifestyle, had drained most of their liquid assets. They were behind on mortgage payments for several properties, including the family estate on Maple Ridge Drive. Creditors were beginning to circle, and the family was desperately seeking ways to access capital that could keep them afloat. The reason David had married me, I realized with growing horror, wasn't love. It was because my successful business and clean credit history made me valuable as a potential source of funding for their failing empire. The investigation Victoria had received was part of their effort to determine how much money they could extract from me before the extent of their financial problems became public knowledge. But David had made a critical error in his assessment of my assets and business structure. While my real estate investment company was indeed profitable, most of my wealth was tied up in properties rather than liquid cash. More importantly, I'd structured my business in a way that protected my personal assets from potential creditors or partners. The Coleman family couldn't simply access my money through marriage, no matter how desperate their situation became. What they didn't know, what David had never bothered to learn despite our years of partnership, was that I'd been quietly acquiring distressed properties throughout Connecticut using a network of shell companies and private investors. While they'd been struggling to maintain their lifestyle and failing to manage their existing holdings, I'd been building a portfolio that included several properties they desperately needed to retain. The most significant of these properties was the Coleman family estate itself. 6 months earlier, when Frank had fallen behind on mortgage payments and faced foreclosure, the bank had quietly sold the note to a private investor at a significant discount. That private investor had been one of my shell companies, purchased with profits from my other successful developments, and financed through private lending arrangements that kept my name off the public records. Patricia Coleman, The woman who'd spent 3 years making me feel like an unwelcome guest in her family, had been living in a house I owned for the past 6 months. Frank Coleman, who dismissed my father's expertise and barely acknowledged my business success, had been paying rent to a company I controlled without realizing it. The entire family, who'd treated me like a social climber seeking access to their diminished fortune, had been dependent on my financial support while planning to extract even more money from me through deception and manipulation. The irony was almost too perfect to believe, but I had documentation for everything. Property deeds, mortgage transfers, rental agreements, all filed properly through my attorneys and structured to maintain complete legal ownership while keeping my involvement private. I had originally planned to eventually reveal my ownership as a surprise gift to David, thinking it would demonstrate my commitment to his family and our shared future. Instead, I now held the key to their entire way of life, and they had no idea how precarious their situation truly was. As I sat in my home office that November evening, reviewing the financial documents spread across my desk, I realized that Thanksgiving dinner at the Coleman estate was going to be very different from what anyone expected. Patricia had been planning this gathering for weeks, inviting extended family members and longtime family friends to what she called her, quote, traditional Thanksgiving celebration. She'd made a point of telling everyone how excited she was to host in the family home, emphasizing the historical significance of the property and the generations of Colemans who'd gathered around its dining room table. But this year, for the first time since I'd married into the family, I wouldn't be attending as the outsider trying to earn my place at their table. I would be coming as the woman who owned the roof over their heads, the floors beneath their feet, and the future they thought belonged to them. The only question remaining was whether I'd reveal this information quietly to David first, giving him a chance to come clean about his family's deception, or wait for the inevitable moment when their desperation led them to show their true colors publicly. Given Patricia's talent for delivering cutting remarks disguised as holiday spirit, I suspected I wouldn't have to wait long for the perfect opportunity to set the record straight. As I locked the documents in my safe and prepared for bed, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. For 3 years I'd questioned my worth, wondered if I truly belonged in the Coleman family, allowed their subtle cruelty to chip away at my confidence. Tomorrow, I would finally understand exactly where I stood. And, more importantly, they would too. The morning after David's confession about his family's financial troubles, I woke up feeling like I was living in a house of mirrors where nothing was quite what it appeared to be. David had already left for the office by the time I emerged from our bedroom, leaving only a hastily scribbled note about an early meeting with potential investors. The cowardice of it struck me immediately. After dropping such a bombshell about his family's deception, he'd chosen to disappear, rather than face the uncomfortable questions I might ask. I made myself coffee and sat at our kitchen island, staring out at the Hartford skyline while processing everything I'd learned. The Coleman family's financial desperation explained so much about the past 3 years of subtle hostility and manipulation. They hadn't been rejecting me because I wasn't good enough for their son. They'd been evaluating me as a potential solution to their monetary problems while simultaneously resenting their dependence on an outsider. The realization should have been devastating, but instead I felt an odd sense of relief. For years I'd internalized their criticism, wondering if I truly was too common, too unsophisticated, too different from their world to belong. Now I understood that their behavior had nothing to do with my worth as a person, and everything to do with their own shame and desperation. My phone rang just as I was finishing my second cup of coffee. Victoria's name flashed on the screen, and I answered immediately, grateful for the familiar voice of my business partner. "Lauren, I've been thinking about that private investigator situation all night," Victoria said without preamble. "Something about it doesn't sit right with me. Why would anyone be asking about your liquidity, unless they were planning to make some kind of financial demand?" I filled Victoria in on David's late-night confession, watching her reaction through our video call as the pieces clicked into place. Victoria had always been more skeptical of my marriage than I'd wanted to acknowledge. She'd questioned why David seemed so interested in my business success but so dismissive of my personal opinions. She'd noticed how family gatherings always left me feeling diminished rather than supported. "Lauren, you need to protect yourself legally before this gets any worse," Victoria said firmly. "If they're desperate enough to hire investigators, They're probably desperate enough to try manipulating you into co-signing loans or liquidating assets to bail them out. Her words resonated deeply because I could already see the groundwork being laid. Over the past few months, David had been increasingly vocal about wanting to expand our real estate portfolio together. He'd suggested consolidating our business interests, combining our assets in ways that would give his family easier access to my capital. Every conversation about our future seemed to circle back to financial planning and investment strategies. Patricia had also been unusually warm lately, inviting me to lunch more frequently and asking detailed questions about my business operations. I'd interpreted this as finally earning her acceptance, but now I realized she'd been conducting reconnaissance, gathering information about my assets and vulnerabilities. The phone call with Victoria lasted over an hour as we strategized about protecting my interests while gathering more information about the Coleman family's true situation. Victoria offered to conduct some discreet inquiries through her network of real estate professionals and financial advisors. If the Colemans were facing significant debts, there would be public records we could access to understand the full scope of their problems. After hanging up with Victoria, I decided to spend the day visiting some of my Connecticut properties, ostensibly to check on maintenance issues, but really to clear my head and think through my options. My first stop was the converted textile mill in Waterbury, where I'd transformed a crumbling industrial building into 24 luxury lofts. The transformation had taken 8 months and every ounce of my renovation expertise, but the result was stunning. The exposed brick walls and soaring ceilings created dramatic living spaces that commanded premium rents. As I walked through the property, greeting tenants and inspecting recent improvements, I felt a surge of pride in what I'd accomplished. This building represented everything I valued about my work, taking something forgotten and bringing it back to life, creating homes where people could build their futures. The success of this project had established my reputation in Connecticut and led directly to other opportunities throughout the state. My next stop was the former department store in New Britain that I'd converted into a bustling community marketplace. Local artisans rented booth space to sell handmade goods, small restaurants offered diverse cuisines, and specialty shops created a vibrant shopping destination that had revitalized an entire downtown block. The energy in the space was infectious, with vendors calling out greetings as I made my rounds and customers clearly enjoying the unique atmosphere I'd created. These projects represented millions of dollars in successful investments, all funded through my own capital and expertise without any assistance from the Coleman family. Yet at every family gathering, Patricia would introduce me as David's wife who dabbled in real estate, as if my professional achievements were merely a hobby to keep me occupied between social obligations. The contrast between my professional confidence and my personal insecurities had never been more stark. In business, I trusted my instincts completely. I could evaluate a property's potential within minutes, negotiate favorable terms with contractors and vendors, and execute complex renovation projects that transformed entire neighborhoods. But in my marriage, I'd allowed myself to be manipulated and diminished by people who had no right to judge my worth. That evening, David returned home late, claiming he'd been working on potential solutions to his family's financial difficulties. He seemed nervous, more talkative than usual, filling the silence with detailed explanations of his day that I hadn't requested. When I asked specific questions about the family's debts and timeline for resolving them, he became vague and evasive. "The important thing is that we're all in this together," he said, reaching across the dinner table to take my hand. "Family takes care of family, right? That's what marriage means." The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. David was laying the groundwork for asking me to financially bail out his family while framing it as a moral obligation rather than the business transaction it actually was. The timing wasn't coincidental either. Thanksgiving was just 2 weeks away, and Patricia had been planning an elaborate family gathering for months. I suspected they intended to present their request during the holiday, using family pressure and emotional manipulation to secure my cooperation. Over the following days, the Coleman family's behavior became increasingly transparent once I knew what to look for. Frank started mentioning how proud he was of my business success, asking detailed questions about my investment strategies and cash flow management. Melissa began including me in conversations about family financial planning, suggesting we should all coordinate our resources more effectively. Even Ryan, who'd barely acknowledged my existence for 3 years, suddenly wanted to discuss potential business partnerships. The most obvious manipulation came from Patricia, who invited me to an exclusive charity luncheon where she introduced me to several prominent Hartford socialites as her brilliant daughter-in-law who's transformed the Connecticut real estate market. The flattery felt hollow because I could sense the agenda behind it. She needed me to feel valued and included so I'd be more receptive to whatever request was coming. During the luncheon, Patricia made a point of discussing the family's historical contributions to Hartford's development, emphasizing their deep roots in the community and their commitment to preserving Connecticut's architectural heritage. She spoke passionately about the importance of maintaining family properties across generations, ensuring that historical landmarks remained in the hands of people who understood their significance. The performance was expertly crafted to appeal to my professional interests and personal values. As someone who specialized in restoring historical buildings, I was naturally drawn to preservation projects. Patricia was positioning their financial crisis as an opportunity for me to help maintain important cultural landmarks, while subtly suggesting that losing these properties would be tantamount to destroying Connecticut's history. But Patricia had made a crucial miscalculation in her manipulation strategy. While she'd researched my professional background thoroughly, she'd never bothered to understand my personal motivations or ethical standards. She assumed that flattery and appeals to family loyalty would be enough to secure my cooperation, not realizing that 3 years of condescension and exclusion had fundamentally altered my relationship with the Coleman family. The week before Thanksgiving, David finally made their request explicitly. We were having dinner at a new restaurant in West Hartford, and he'd been unusually attentive throughout the meal, asking about my day and expressing interest in my current projects. The conversation felt performative, like he was following a script he'd rehearsed. "Lauren, I need to talk to you about something important," he said as we finished our entrees. "My family is going through a difficult period financially, and we're hoping you might be able to help us work through some temporary challenges." The word temporary was particularly galling because I'd seen their financial records. The Coleman family's problems weren't temporary setbacks that could be resolved with a short-term loan. They represented years of poor decisions, lifestyle inflation, and fundamental mismanagement that had eroded the foundation of their wealth. David outlined their proposal with the confidence of someone who believed he was offering me an opportunity rather than asking for charity. They wanted me to co-sign loans that would allow them to restructure their debts, provide temporary funding to bring their property maintenance up to date, and potentially invest in new ventures that could generate income to stabilize their situation. The numbers he mentioned were staggering. They needed immediate access to over $2 million just to address their most pressing obligations. Long-term, they were hoping I could provide ongoing financial support while they rebuilt their investment portfolio and restored their cash flow. Of course, this would all be documented properly, David assured me. "We're not asking for charity. This is a business arrangement between family members, with appropriate interest rates and repayment schedules. You'd have security interests in all the family properties, so there's no risk to your investment." The irony of his last statement was almost too much to bear. David was offering me security interests in properties I already owned, promising to protect investments I'd already made, guaranteeing returns on capital I'd already deployed. If the situation hadn't been so personally devastating, it might have been comically absurd. I listened to his entire presentation without interrupting, maintaining the neutral expression I'd perfected during difficult business negotiations. When he finished, I asked a few clarifying questions about timelines and terms, giving no indication of my response to his proposal. "This is obviously a significant decision," I said finally. "I'll need time to review the details with my financial advisors and attorneys. Family business should be handled as professionally as any other investment opportunity." David's relief was palpable, as if my willingness to consider their request was tantamount to acceptance. He reached across the table to squeeze my hand, his smile more genuine than I'd seen in months. "I knew you'd understand," he said. "Family takes care of family. That's what makes us strong." But as we drove home that evening, I wasn't thinking about family loyalty or financial obligations. I was thinking about the documents locked in my home safe, the property deeds and mortgage transfers that revealed the true nature of our relationship. The Coleman family had spent 3 years making me feel like a charity case who should be grateful for their acceptance. Now they were asking me to actually become their financial savior while remaining oblivious to the fact that I'd already been supporting them for months. The next morning, I called Victoria to update her on the situation and discuss my options. She'd completed her research into the Coleman family's financial status, and her findings were even worse than David had admitted. "Lauren, they're not just facing temporary difficulties," Victoria said grimly. "They're essentially bankrupt. The family business has been operating at a loss for over 2 years. Frank has gambling debts that exceed their liquid assets. Patricia has been funding her lifestyle with credit cards and personal loans. They've already liquidated most of their valuable personal property, including jewelry and artwork that had been in the family for generations. The research also revealed that I wasn't their first potential solution. Over the past year, they'd approached several other family members and longtime friends seeking financial assistance. Most had declined or offered amounts far smaller than what the Colemans needed. I was their last realistic option for avoiding complete financial collapse. "There's something else you need to know," Victoria continued. "The private investigator who contacted me wasn't just gathering information about your assets. He was also researching your personal background, looking for potential leverage they could use to pressure you into helping them." The invasion of privacy was infuriating, but not particularly surprising given everything else I'd learned about their character. The Coleman family had approached our relationship as a business transaction from the very beginning, evaluating my potential utility, while maintaining the pretense of personal affection. Victoria and I spent over an hour discussing potential responses to their request. From a purely financial perspective, the Coleman family represented a catastrophic investment risk. Their problems were too extensive, and their management too incompetent to justify any significant capital commitment. Even if I could afford to bail them out completely, doing so would likely just delay their eventual bankruptcy while depleting my own resources. But the situation was complicated by my existing ownership of their most valuable asset. The family estate on Maple Ridge Drive was worth approximately $3 million, and I'd acquired it for less than half that amount when the bank sold their defaulted mortgage. If the Coleman family discovered my ownership before I was ready to reveal it, they might claim fraud or undue influence, potentially creating legal complications that could affect my other business interests. After considerable discussion, Victoria and I agreed that my best strategy was to maintain my current position while gathering additional information about their plans. If they were hoping to manipulate me emotionally during Thanksgiving dinner, I needed to be prepared for whatever tactics they might employ. The week leading up to Thanksgiving brought a flurry of family communications that felt more coordinated than coincidental. Patricia called twice to discuss menu planning and seating arrangements, each conversation including casual mentions of how grateful she was to have me as part of the family. Melissa texted regularly with updates about which relatives would be attending, always emphasizing how excited everyone was to see me and how much I meant to the family. Frank even made an unprecedented personal visit to my office, ostensibly to discuss a potential real estate investment, but actually to deliver what felt like a prepared speech about family values and mutual support. He spoke movingly about the importance of preserving family legacy across generations, about how proud he was of my business success, and about how much he looked forward to working together on future projects. The manipulation campaign was so obvious it was almost insulting. After 3 years of treating me like an unwelcome guest at their gatherings, they were suddenly behaving as if I'd always been a cherished family member. The transformation was too dramatic and too convenient to be genuine. David's behavior was particularly transparent. He'd become unusually affectionate, bringing me flowers without occasion, suggesting romantic dinners, and expressing interest in my daily activities that he'd previously ignored. He also started mentioning our future together more frequently, talking about potential vacation destinations and long-term goals, as if ensuring I felt emotionally invested in our relationship, before asking me to financially invest in his family's survival. The night before Thanksgiving, as I was preparing my contribution to the family dinner, David approached the topic one final time. We were in our kitchen, and I was assembling a complex dessert that had taken most of the day to prepare. Patricia had specifically requested that I bring something special, and I'd chosen to make individual chocolate soufflés that would showcase my attention to detail and culinary skills. "Lauren, I know tomorrow is going to be overwhelming with everyone there, but I'm hoping we can give my parents some good news about the financial situation," David said, attempting to sound casual while clearly feeling anxious. I looked up from the delicate work of preparing the soufflé dishes, meeting his eyes directly. What kind of good news are you hoping for? Well, that you've decided to help us through this difficult time, he replied. I know it's a big ask, but it would mean everything to my family. Especially to my mother. She's been so worried about losing the house. The mention of the house was particularly ironic, given that Patricia had already lost it 6 months earlier when the bank foreclosed on their mortgage. She'd been living as my tenant ever since, paying rent through a property management company that had carefully concealed my ownership. Tomorrow's dinner would take place in my house, at my table, with food prepared in my kitchen, while the Coleman family maintained the illusion that they were hosting me in their ancestral home. David, this isn't the kind of decision that should be announced at a family dinner, I said carefully. Financial arrangements this significant require proper legal documentation and professional oversight. Mixing family emotions with business decisions rarely works out well for anyone involved. His expression shifted slightly, revealing a flash of frustration before he composed himself again. Of course you're right about the professional aspects. But sometimes family members need to know they can count on each other. That's what gives people hope during difficult times. The emotional manipulation was so blatant it was almost comical. David was trying to frame my potential refusal as a betrayal of family loyalty, setting up tomorrow's dinner as a test of my commitment to the Coleman clan. If I didn't provide the financial support they needed, I would be positioned as the selfish outsider who abandoned them during their time of crisis. But David had fundamentally misunderstood the dynamics of our situation. He believed he held the power in our relationship because he'd been born into an established family with social connections and historical prestige. He assumed that my desire to belong would override my business instincts and personal self-respect. What he didn't realize was that his family's financial collapse had completely shifted the balance of power between us. They needed me far more than I needed them, and their desperation was making them reckless in ways that would ultimately expose their true character. As I finished preparing the soufflés for tomorrow's dinner, I felt a strange sense of anticipation building. For 3 years I'd attended Coleman family gatherings feeling like I was auditioning for acceptance that would never come. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow I would finally understand exactly where I stood with these people, and more importantly, they would finally understand exactly who they'd been underestimating all along. The stage was set for a Thanksgiving dinner that would reveal the truth about everything we'd all been pretending to believe. Patricia would play the gracious hostess in a house she didn't own, Frank would pontificate about family values while hiding his gambling addiction, and David would continue manipulating our marriage to serve his family's financial interests. But this time I would be holding all the cards they didn't even know were in play. The question wasn't whether they would show their true colors. Their desperation guaranteed that. The question was whether I would reveal mine in return, or continue playing the role of the grateful daughter-in-law who didn't know her own worth. As I went to bed that night, I realized I was actually looking forward to tomorrow's dinner in a way I'd never experienced before. For the first time since joining the Coleman family, I would be attending one of their gatherings from a position of complete strength, rather than desperate hope for acceptance. Whatever happened at that Thanksgiving table, it would finally be honest. And after 3 years of living with their lies and manipulations, honesty was exactly what we all needed, whether they realized it or not. Thanksgiving morning arrived with the kind of crisp November sunshine that made Connecticut's autumn foliage look like something from a postcard. I woke early, before David's alarm, and lay quietly watching him sleep while processing the magnitude of what I'd discovered about his family's deception. His face looked peaceful in the morning light, almost innocent, making it difficult to reconcile this version of my husband with the calculating manipulator who'd been orchestrating my emotional and financial exploitation for months. I slipped out of bed without disturbing him and made my way to the kitchen, where my soufflés waited in the refrigerator. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent yesterday afternoon perfecting a complex dessert to impress people who saw me as nothing more than a potential ATM. But the effort hadn't been wasted. Today, those soufflés would serve as a symbol of everything I'd brought to this family that they'd never properly valued. Skill, dedication, and a level of sophistication they couldn't achieve themselves despite their pretensions. As I prepared my morning coffee, I reflected on how dramatically my perspective had shifted over the past few weeks. 3 years of self-doubt and insecurity had evaporated once I understood the true dynamics of my relationship with the Coleman family. They hadn't been rejecting me because I wasn't good enough for their world. They'd been evaluating me as a resource while resenting their dependence on someone they considered beneath their social status. The revelation was simultaneously devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant my marriage had been built on deception from the very beginning. Liberating because it explained every confusing interaction, every moment of feeling like I was failing some invisible test, every instance of wondering why I couldn't earn the acceptance I'd been desperately seeking. David emerged from our bedroom around 7:30, already dressed in the kind of expensive casual wear that Patricia had taught me to recognize as appropriate for family gatherings. His choice of a cashmere sweater and tailored slacks worth more than most people's monthly salary sent a clear message about the image he wanted to project today. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, kissing my cheek with the kind of performative affection that had become his trademark lately. "Are you excited about dinner? Mom's been planning this for weeks." The casual mention of Patricia's planning struck me as particularly absurd, given that every detail of today's meal was being executed in a house I owned, with utilities I was paying for, using furniture and fixtures that had been pledged as collateral for debts they couldn't meet. Patricia hadn't been planning a family gathering so much as staging a performance designed to manipulate me into funding their lifestyle. "I'm looking forward to spending time with everyone," I replied diplomatically, not wanting to reveal my hand too early in the day. David seemed satisfied with my response, launching into an enthusiastic description of the guests who would be joining us. The list included not just immediate family members but also several longtime family friends and business associates who'd been invited to witness whatever announcement the Colemans were hoping to make about their financial situation. The guest list was strategically constructed to maximize social pressure while providing an audience for my expected capitulation to their demands. By including respected community members and business leaders, Patricia had created a scenario where refusing to help would appear selfish and small-minded to people whose opinions supposedly mattered in Connecticut society. But Patricia had made a fundamental miscalculation about my priorities and motivations. She assumed that social acceptance was my primary goal, that I'd sacrifice my financial security and self-respect to maintain relationships with people who'd never genuinely welcomed me into their circle. She didn't understand that 3 years of their condescension had cured me of any desire for their approval. We arrived at the Maple Ridge Drive estate at 11 o'clock, pulling into the circular driveway behind several other luxury vehicles that belonged to early arriving guests. The house looked magnificent in the autumn sunlight, its colonial architecture and perfectly maintained landscaping creating the impression of timeless prosperity and stability. Only I knew that the entire facade was being maintained through my financial support. Patricia greeted us at the front door, wearing an elegant burgundy dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her enthusiasm for seeing me was more pronounced than I'd ever experienced, complete with air kisses and compliments about my appearance that felt scripted rather than sincere. "Lauren, darling, you look absolutely stunning," she gushed, guiding me into the formal living room where other guests were already assembled. "And thank you so much for bringing those soufflés. I've been telling everyone about your culinary talents." The performance was expertly crafted to position me as a valued family member, rather than an outsider seeking acceptance. Patricia was creating a narrative where my contributions were appreciated and my presence was essential to the family's happiness. The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting, but I played along while mentally cataloging every false note. The guest list was exactly what I'd expected, a carefully curated selection of Hartford's social elite, mixed with Coleman family members who'd been briefed on their roles in today's performance. Frank was holding court near the fireplace, regaling a small group with stories about the family's historical contributions to Connecticut's development. Melissa was circulating with a silver tray of appetizers, playing the role of gracious hostess, while making sure everyone knew how happy she was that I'd become part of their family. Even Ryan had transformed from his usual sullen indifference into something resembling charm, asking about my business ventures and expressing admiration for my success in Connecticut's competitive real estate market. The sudden interest from someone who'd barely acknowledged my existence for 3 years was so obviously calculated that I wondered if they'd actually rehearsed their performances. The most revealing moment came when I was introduced to Judge Harrison Whitmore, a distinguished gentleman in his 70s who'd apparently known the Coleman family for decades. Patricia made a point of emphasizing my professional accomplishments while describing how grateful they were to have someone with my expertise as part of their family. Lauren has been such a blessing, Patricia said, her hand resting possessively on my arm. Her understanding of real estate and finance has been invaluable during some challenging times. We're so fortunate to have someone we can trust completely to help guide important family decisions. Judge Whitmore nodded approvingly, clearly impressed by Patricia's description of our relationship. What he didn't realize was that he was witnessing an elaborate setup designed to pressure me into making financial commitments in front of witnesses who would remember my promises. As the morning progressed, I began to notice how strategically the conversations were being directed. Multiple guests made comments about the importance of family loyalty during difficult times. Several people mentioned their admiration for family members who'd made personal sacrifices to help relatives through temporary setbacks. The message was clear. Generous family support was expected behavior among people of quality and character. The manipulation reached its peak when Frank pulled me aside for what appeared to be a casual conversation about my business philosophy. We were standing in the study, surrounded by leather-bound books and family portraits that emphasized the Coleman legacy of success and respectability. "Lauren, I've been watching your career with great admiration," Frank began, his tone suggesting intimate confidence rather than public performance. "Your ability to see potential in undervalued properties reminds me of my own father's investment strategies. He always said the key to building lasting wealth was recognizing opportunities that others overlooked." The comparison to Coleman family investment wisdom was clearly intended as a compliment, positioning me as someone who shared their sophisticated understanding of financial markets. Frank was creating a narrative where helping his family would demonstrate my business acumen rather than my emotional vulnerability. "Of course, the most rewarding investments are often the ones that benefit people you care about," Frank continued smoothly. "There's something deeply satisfying about using your success to create opportunities for family members. It's what separates true wealth from mere money." The philosophical framework Frank was constructing was designed to make my potential refusal seem not just selfish but unsophisticated. According to his logic, truly successful people used their resources to benefit family members, while lesser individuals hoarded their wealth for purely personal gain. But Frank's manipulation revealed more about his character than mine. He was so desperate to access my resources that he was willing to fabricate an entire philosophy of family obligation to justify his request. The performance was expertly delivered, but it couldn't disguise the fundamental dishonesty of his position. As we moved into the dining room for the formal meal, I found myself studying the space with new eyes. The massive mahogany table had been set with Patricia's finest china and crystal, creating an atmosphere of elegance and tradition that was supposed to remind me of everything I'd gained by marrying into the Coleman family. But all I could think about was the mortgage documents in my safe that proved I owned every piece of furniture, every decorative object, every architectural detail that was being used to impress me. The seating arrangement placed me in a position of honor at Patricia's right hand, with Judge Whitmore directly across from me and other distinguished guests nearby. The placement was clearly strategic, ensuring that any announcement about family financial arrangements would occur in front of witnesses who could later attest to my voluntary agreement to provide support. Patricia had outdone herself with the menu, featuring traditional Thanksgiving dishes prepared with expensive ingredients and sophisticated techniques that showcased her commitment to maintaining family standards despite their financial difficulties. The irony was breathtaking. She was using my money to purchase groceries and hire catering staff to prepare a meal designed to convince me to give her more money. The conversation during the meal was equally calculated, with multiple guests sharing stories about families who'd overcome financial challenges through mutual support and cooperation. Patricia contributed a particularly pointed anecdote about friends who'd avoided bankruptcy because their daughter-in-law had provided temporary financial assistance that allowed them to restructure their debts successfully. "It's remarkable how quickly situations can improve when families work together," Patricia observed meaningfully. "Sometimes all it takes is one person with the resources and vision to see past temporary difficulties to the underlying value of family assets." The comment was clearly directed at me, with Patricia's choice of words emphasizing that helping her family would demonstrate my sophisticated understanding of investment opportunities rather than my emotional manipulation. She was framing their financial crisis as a business proposition that any intelligent person would recognize as profitable. But Patricia's approach revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of both my character and our relationship. She assumed that I shared her values about social status and family obligation, that I would sacrifice my financial security to maintain appearances among people whose respect I supposedly craved. What she didn't realize was that 3 years of condescension and exclusion had fundamentally altered my priorities. I no longer cared about earning acceptance from people who'd made it clear that I would always be an outsider in their world. Their current desperation for my help only highlighted the hypocrisy of their previous treatment. The turning point came during dessert service, when my individual chocolate soufflés were presented with the kind of elaborate ceremony usually reserved for wedding cakes. Patricia made a production of praising my culinary skills while ensuring that every guest understood the time and effort I'd invested in creating something special for their gathering. "Lauren prepared these herself," Patricia announced proudly. "She's so talented in everything she does. We're incredibly blessed to have someone with her skills and dedication as part of our family." The praise felt hollow because I could hear the agenda behind every word. Patricia was establishing my value as a family member, while simultaneously creating expectations about my future contributions to their welfare. She was positioning today's soufflé as a preview of everything I could provide if properly motivated and appreciated. As guests sampled the dessert and offered compliments about my technique, I realized this was the moment Patricia had been building toward all day. The stage was set for whatever announcement or request she'd planned, with an audience of respected community members who would remember my response and judge my character accordingly. Frank cleared his throat and stood, raising his wineglass in what appeared to be an impromptu toast but was clearly a rehearsed performance. The dining room fell silent as everyone turned their attention toward the head of the table. "I'd like to take a moment to express gratitude for the many blessings our family has experienced this year," Frank began, his voice carrying the kind of gravitas that came naturally to someone accustomed to commanding attention. "In particular, I want to acknowledge how much Lauren has brought to our family, not just through her marriage to David, but through her wisdom, her expertise, and her generous spirit." The toast was expertly constructed to position me as someone whose contributions were already appreciated, while creating expectations about my future role in the family's financial planning. Frank was building a narrative where helping them would be consistent with my established pattern of generosity, rather than a new obligation being imposed upon me. "Lauren has shown us what it means to be truly committed to family success," Frank continued, his eyes meeting mine across the table. "Her understanding of real estate and investment has been invaluable as we've navigated some challenging market conditions this year." The euphemism about challenging market conditions was particularly galling, given that their problems had nothing to do with external economic factors, and everything to do with poor decision-making and lifestyle choices they'd refused to adjust despite their declining resources. But Frank wasn't finished with his performance. He raised his glass higher, inviting the other guests to join him in acknowledging my supposed contributions to the family's welfare. "To Lauren," he declared warmly, "whose partnership has been such a blessing during difficult times, and whose continued support will help ensure that the Coleman family legacy continues for generations to come." The toast was met with enthusiastic agreement from the assembled guests, who raised their glasses and offered their own compliments about my character and commitment to family values. The moment felt surreal, like watching a play where I was simultaneously the honored guest and the target of an elaborate con game. As the applause died down and Frank resumed his seat, Patricia leaned closer to me with the kind of intimate smile that suggested we were about to share a special moment between women who understood each other completely. "Lauren, darling," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure nearby guests could hear our conversation. "Frank and I have been hoping to discuss some exciting opportunities for family collaboration. Perhaps after our guests leave, we could sit down together and talk about ways to combine our resources for mutual benefit." The invitation was phrased as a casual suggestion between family members, but the timing and setting made it clear that this was the moment they'd been orchestrating all day. Patricia was creating a public expectation that I would participate in financial discussions, while positioning any refusal as a rejection of family harmony in front of witnesses who'd just toasted my commitment to Coleman family success. The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting, but also strangely liberating. After 3 years of wondering why I couldn't earn their acceptance, I finally understood that acceptance had never been on the table. They'd been evaluating me as a resource from the beginning, and today's performance was simply the culmination of their long-term strategy to access my wealth. As I looked around the table at faces that had pretended to welcome me while secretly calculating my utility, I felt a profound sense of clarity settling over me. These people had never been my family, and I had never been their daughter-in-law in any meaningful sense. We'd all been actors in an elaborate financial transaction disguised as personal relationships. The realization should have been devastating, but instead I felt something approaching relief. For the first time since marrying David, I understood exactly where I stood with these people. The uncertainty and self-doubt that had plagued me for years evaporated as I recognized the truth about our relationships. Patricia was still smiling expectantly, waiting for my response to her invitation for financial discussions. The other guests had resumed their conversations, but were clearly listening for my answer. David was watching me with barely concealed anxiety, knowing that his family's financial survival depended on my willingness to play along with their charade. But I had one crucial advantage that none of them realized. While they'd been plotting to manipulate me into funding their lifestyle, I'd been quietly acquiring control over the assets they needed most. They were sitting in my house, eating food purchased with my money, planning to ask me to save properties I already owned. The irony was so perfect it was almost poetic. They'd spent 3 years making me feel like a charity case who should be grateful for their grudging acceptance. Now they were about to discover that they'd been the charity case all along, dependent on my financial support while remaining completely oblivious to their true situation. Patricia's smile was beginning to look strained as she waited for my response to her invitation. The silence was stretching long enough to make nearby guests uncomfortable, and I could sense David's growing panic as he realized I wasn't following the script they'd prepared. This was the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since the day I married into this family. The moment when I would finally understand my true value in their lives, and they would finally understand theirs and mine. The only question remaining was whether I would reveal my knowledge immediately or allow their desperation to expose their true character even further. As I met Patricia's expectant gaze across the table, I realized that the real Thanksgiving dinner was about to begin. Everything up until now had been appetizers. The main course would be the truth about who these people really were, and what they were willing to do to get what they needed from me. I took a sip of wine, smiled at Patricia with the same false warmth she'd been showing me all day, and prepared to deliver my response to 3 years of manipulation and condescension. The reckoning they'd been unknowingly building toward was about to begin. I set down my wine glass with deliberate precision, the crystal making a soft chime against the mahogany table that seemed to echo in the expectant silence. Patricia's smile remained frozen in place, but I could see the first hints of uncertainty flickering in her eyes as the pause stretched beyond what social convention deemed comfortable. Around the table, conversations had died away as guests sensed the tension building between us. "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity for discussion, Patricia," I said finally, my voice carrying the same warm tone I'd perfected during 3 years of navigating Coleman family gatherings. I'm always interested in learning more about family collaboration, especially when it involves such significant financial decisions. Relief flooded Patricia's face, and I watched David's shoulders relax as he misinterpreted my diplomatic response as agreement to their scheme. Frank raised his wineglass again in a gesture of premature celebration, while Melissa exchanged a meaningful glance with Ryan that suggested they'd all been briefed on their roles in today's performance. But I wasn't finished speaking. The pause I allowed was just long enough for their confidence to solidify before I continued with the rest of my response. "However, I think it's important that we're all completely transparent about the current financial situation before making any commitments," I added, my tone remaining pleasant despite the bombshell I was about to drop. After all, informed decisions require complete information about all parties involved. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the implications of my words sank in. Patricia's smile faltered, and Frank's wineglass froze halfway to his lips. Judge Whitmore and the other distinguished guests leaned forward slightly, sensing that they were about to witness something far more dramatic than a routine family discussion about investment opportunities. David attempted to intervene with a nervous laugh. "Lauren, perhaps we should save the detailed financial discussions for later, when we have more privacy." Oh, I think our guests would find this quite educational, I replied, turning to address the broader table while maintaining my composed demeanor, especially those who work in finance and real estate. After all, this is exactly the kind of complex family situation that requires professional expertise to navigate properly. I could practically feel the panic radiating from the Coleman family members as they realized I wasn't following their carefully orchestrated script. The distinguished guests Patricia had invited to witness my capitulation were about to see something entirely different than what had been planned. You see, I continued, rising from my chair with the same graceful confidence I'd learned to project during business presentations. I've spent considerable time over the past few months researching the Coleman family's financial portfolio, and I've made some fascinating discoveries. Patricia's face had gone completely white, and I could see her calculating whether to interrupt me or allow me to continue speaking. Frank was gripping his wine glass so tightly I thought it might shatter, while David looked like he was considering making a run for the nearest exit. For instance, I learned that the Coleman Investment Group has been operating at a significant loss for over 2 years, with debts that far exceed their remaining liquid assets. I paused to let this information sink in among the guests, several of whom were prominent figures in Hartford's financial community who would immediately understand the implications. Judge Whitmore's eyebrows rose sharply, and I could see him reassessing everything he'd been told about the family's current situation. The other guests began exchanging glances that ranged from shock to poorly concealed schadenfreude, depending on their relationship with the Coleman family. I also discovered that several properties in the family portfolio are facing foreclosure proceedings, including some that have been mortgaged multiple times to cover operating expenses and personal debts. I turned to look directly at Frank, whose gambling problem was apparently more extensive than even David had admitted to me. The silence in the room was deafening. Patricia appeared to be having difficulty breathing, while Melissa had gone pale enough that I wondered if she might faint. Ryan was staring at his plate as if hoping he could disappear entirely. But I was just getting started. 3 years of accumulated frustration and humiliation were fueling my desire to expose every lie they'd told about their situation and their treatment of me. Most interesting of all, I continued, my voice gaining strength as I watched their carefully constructed facade crumble in real time, I discovered that this beautiful house we're sitting in today, this symbol of Coleman family legacy and tradition, was actually foreclosed on by Hartford National Bank 6 months ago. The gasps from the assembled guests were audible, and I could see Patricia clutching the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Frank looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past minute, while David had buried his face in his hands in complete defeat. The bank sold the mortgage to a private investor at a significant discount, which means the Coleman family has been living here as tenants rather than owners since last spring. I paused to take a sip of wine, allowing the full impact of this revelation to settle over the room. Judge Whitmore was shaking his head slowly, clearly appalled by the deception he'd unwittingly witnessed. The other guests were beginning to murmur among themselves, and I could see several people discreetly checking their phones, probably to share this unexpected development with friends who hadn't been fortunate enough to witness it firsthand. Patricia finally found her voice, though it came out as little more than a hoarse whisper. "Lauren, how dare you humiliate our family in front of our guests? This is neither the time nor the place for such discussions." Her attempt to reclaim moral authority might have worked if I hadn't been holding the ultimate trump card. The irony of her accusation about humiliation was particularly rich, given that she'd invited these guests specifically to witness what she'd assumed would be my public capitulation to their financial demands. "You're absolutely right, Patricia," I agreed with mock sincerity. "This is neither the time nor the place for humiliation. Which makes me wonder why you chose today to ask me to bail out your family's catastrophic financial mismanagement in front of all these distinguished witnesses." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired cannon. Several guests were now openly staring at Patricia and Frank, waiting to see how they would respond to being exposed as manipulative frauds in front of their social circle. Frank attempted to salvage the situation with bluster and indignation. "Young lady, I don't know where you're getting this information, but you have no right to air private family matters in front of our guests. This behavior is completely inappropriate." His attempt at patriarchal authority would have been more effective if his voice hadn't been shaking with panic. I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the comfortable temperature in the dining room. "Private family matters?" I repeated, my tone sharpening for the first time since I'd begun speaking. "Is that what you call asking your daughter-in-law to co-sign loans for $2 million to cover your gambling debts and your wife's credit card spending?" The specificity of the numbers hit the room like a physical blow. Judge Whitmore was openly staring now, clearly recognizing the legal implications of what I was describing. The other guests were beginning to shift uncomfortably in their chairs, realizing they'd been invited to witness what amounted to an elaborate con game. Melissa finally found the courage to speak, though her voice was barely audible. "Lauren, please stop. You're destroying our family." Her plea for mercy might have moved me if I hadn't spent 3 years watching her participate in my systematic exclusion and humiliation. The tears in her eyes looked genuine, but I'd learned not to trust Coleman family emotions when their financial interests were at stake. "I'm not destroying anything, Melissa," I replied calmly. "I'm simply providing the complete financial picture that your parents chose not to share before asking me to risk my own business and personal assets to cover their debts." I turned back to address Patricia directly, knowing that she was the architect of today's elaborate manipulation. "Did you really think I would hand over $2 million without conducting proper due diligence? Did you assume I was too unsophisticated to understand the difference between a sound investment and a desperate bailout?" Quote. Patricia's mask of social grace had completely slipped away, revealing the calculating opportunist underneath. "We're family, Lauren. Family takes care of each other during difficult times. That's what marriage means." The appeal to family loyalty was her last desperate attempt to manipulate me, but it only highlighted the fundamental hypocrisy of her position. For 3 years, she'd made it clear that I wasn't really family, that I was an outsider who'd married above her station, and should be grateful for their grudging acceptance. "Family?" I repeated, letting the word hang in the air while I considered its implications. "Is that what you call 3 years of condescension, exclusion, and barely disguised contempt? Is that what you call hiring a private investigator to research my personal finances without my knowledge or consent?" The revelation about the private investigator sent another wave of shock through the assembled guests. Several people were now looking at Patricia and Frank with undisguised disgust, clearly appalled by the invasion of privacy I'd described. David finally raised his head from his hands, his face flushed with embarrassment and desperation. "Lauren, please. Whatever problems we have as a family, we can work them out privately. This isn't helping anyone." His plea was technically true, but it ignored the fundamental fact that they'd created this public situation by inviting witnesses to what they'd planned as my financial capitulation. They'd chosen to make their manipulation attempt a public performance, and now they were upset that I'd turned their theater against them. "You're right, David," I agreed, my voice softening slightly as I looked at my husband with something approaching pity. "This isn't helping anyone. But it is revealing who everyone really is, when their backs are against the wall." The truth in that statement was becoming more apparent with each passing moment. Patricia's gracious hostess persona had evaporated, revealing the desperate manipulator underneath. Frank's dignified patriarch act had crumbled, exposing a weak man who'd gambled away his family's security. Even David's charming husband facade was wearing thin, showing the calculating opportunist who'd married me for my money rather than my love. But I still had one more revelation that would complete their humiliation and demonstrate just how thoroughly they'd miscalculated their relationship with me. However, since we're already discussing private family financial matters in front of our guests, I continued, returning to the composed tone I'd maintained throughout this confrontation, "I think it's only fair that I share the rest of the story about this house." Patricia's eyes widened with terror as she realized I wasn't finished exposing their secrets. The guests were now completely silent, recognizing that they were witnessing something far more dramatic than a typical family disagreement about money. "You see, when I mentioned that Hartford National Bank sold the mortgage to a private investor, I didn't specify who that investor was." I paused for dramatic effect, enjoying the moment of suspense as everyone in the room waited for the final revelation. The private investor who purchased this property 6 months ago was Riverside Holdings LLC, which is one of my shell companies. I let this information sink in for a moment before delivering the knockout punch. Which means I've been your landlord since last spring, Patricia. You've been living in my house. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Patricia made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob, while Frank's wine glass finally slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered against the floor. Melissa burst into tears, and Ryan looked like he was going to be physically sick. But it was David's reaction that affected me most profoundly. My husband, the man who'd promised to love and honor me, who'd spent months manipulating our marriage to serve his family's financial interests, simply stared at me with undisguised hatred. In that moment, any lingering hope I might have harbored about saving our relationship died completely. Judge Whitmore was the first guest to break the stunned silence that followed my revelation. "My dear," he said to me with something approaching admiration, "I believe you've just delivered the most comprehensive financial education I've witnessed in 40 years of legal practice." His comment broke the spell that had held the room frozen, and several other guests began to murmur their agreement. I could see them reassessing everything they'd witnessed today, understanding now that they'd been watching a masterclass in strategic planning rather than a family argument about money. Patricia attempted one last desperate gambit to regain control of the situation. "This is unconscionable," she declared, her voice shaking with fury. "You deceived us. You've been manipulating our family while pretending to be a loving daughter-in-law." The accusation was so hypocritical it was almost comical. Patricia was accusing me of manipulation while sitting in a house I owned, after spending the entire day orchestrating an elaborate scheme to extract money from me through emotional blackmail and social pressure. "I've been manipulating you?" I repeated with genuine amazement. "Patricia, you invited 23 people to witness what you assumed would be my agreement to fund your family's financial recovery. You've spent the entire day positioning this request as a test of my character and family loyalty. And you're accusing me of manipulation?" I gestured toward the assembled guests, several of whom were nodding in agreement with my assessment. Everyone in this room has spent the past hour listening to carefully orchestrated speeches about family values and mutual support, all designed to pressure me into writing checks for debts I didn't create, to cover problems you've been hiding for months. The accuracy of my summary was evident in the faces of the guests, who were now looking at Patricia and Frank with undisguised disapproval. Judge Whitmore appeared particularly offended by the deception he'd unwittingly participated in. Frank made one final attempt to salvage his dignity by appealing to traditional gender roles and family hierarchy. "Lauren, regardless of whatever business arrangements you may have made, you are still my son's wife and part of this family. You have obligations that extend beyond financial considerations." His invocation of family obligations might have carried more weight if he hadn't spent 3 years treating me like an unwelcome guest at family gatherings. The hypocrisy was so blatant that several guests actually laughed out loud at his presumption. "Obligations," I repeated thoughtfully. "Let me tell you about obligations, Frank. For 3 years, I've fulfilled every obligation you could possibly expect from a daughter-in-law. I've attended every family gathering with a smile, contributed to every holiday celebration, supported your son's career, and built a successful business that brought credit to the Coleman name." I paused to look around the table at faces that had become increasingly hostile as their financial desperation had been exposed. But apparently, my only real obligation was to serve as your family's emergency bank account when your poor decisions finally caught up with you. The bluntness of my assessment hit the room like a slap. Several guests were now openly staring at Frank and Patricia with expressions of disgust, clearly appalled by their behavior. David made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation by appealing directly to our marriage. "Lauren, I love you. Whatever mistakes my family has made, that doesn't change what we have together. We can work through this." His declaration of love would have been more convincing if I hadn't seen the hatred in his eyes just moments earlier. The performance was so transparently calculated that even some of the guests looked embarrassed for him. "What we have together, David," I replied sadly, "is a marriage built on deception and financial opportunism. You pursued me because you thought I could solve your family's money problems, not because you loved who I am as a person." The truth of that statement was evident in his inability to deny it convincingly. David opened and closed his mouth several times, but no words came out. He couldn't claim to love me while simultaneously asking me to bankrupt myself to cover his family's debts. I turned to address Patricia one final time, knowing that this would be our last conversation as family members. You asked me earlier about family collaboration and mutual benefit. Here's what I'm prepared to offer. The room fell completely silent as everyone waited to hear my terms. Patricia leaned forward slightly, hope flickering in her eyes as she wondered if I might still be willing to provide the financial support they desperately needed. You can continue living in this house for the remainder of your lease, which expires at the end of March, I said matter-of-factly. The rent is current, and I'll honor the existing agreement. After that, you'll need to find alternative accommodations that better suit your actual financial circumstances. The generosity of my offer was more than they deserved, and everyone in the room knew it. I was giving them 4 months to find new housing and adjust to their reduced circumstances, which was far more consideration than they'd ever shown me. As for the other properties in financial distress, I'm prepared to purchase any assets you're willing to sell at fair market value. This will provide you with immediate capital to address your most pressing debts, while ensuring the properties are maintained properly. Several guests nodded approvingly at my business-like approach to the family's problems. I was offering practical solutions based on realistic assessments rather than emotional appeals or family obligations. Patricia's face had gone through several color changes as she processed my offer. The realization that I was treating their crisis as a business transaction rather than a family emergency was clearly devastating to someone who'd spent her entire adult life relying on emotional manipulation to get what she wanted. "That's it?" she whispered. "After everything this family has given you, that's all you're willing to do?" Her question revealed the fundamental delusion that had driven their treatment of me throughout our relationship. Patricia genuinely believed that allowing me to marry David and attend family gatherings constituted generous gifts that obligated me to unlimited financial support. "What exactly has this family given me, Patricia?" I asked with genuine curiosity. 3 years of condescension? Constant criticism of my background and accomplishments? Systematic exclusion from family activities? A husband who married me for my business connections rather than personal affection? The accuracy of my summary was evident in her inability to provide a meaningful response. She'd been so focused on what she could extract from me that she'd never considered what she was offering in return. I stood up from the table, recognizing that our conversation had reached its natural conclusion. The assembled guests were watching with fascination as 3 years of family dysfunction reached its inevitable climax. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, addressing the entire room with the same professional composure I'd maintained throughout this confrontation. "I apologize that your Thanksgiving dinner has become unexpectedly educational. I'm sure you all have better ways to spend your holiday than watching family financial planning meetings." Several guests chuckled at my diplomatic description of what they'd witnessed, clearly appreciating my ability to maintain dignity despite the circumstances. Judge Whitmore raised his wine glass in what appeared to be a salute to my performance. I walked around the table to where David was still seated, looking like his entire world had collapsed around him. In many ways it had. His family's financial empire was crumbling, his marriage was ending, and his carefully constructed image as a successful businessman had been exposed as an elaborate fraud. "David, I'll be staying at the Hartford Marriott tonight. My attorney will contact you Monday morning to discuss divorce proceedings and property settlements." I kept my voice gentle despite everything that had happened, recognizing that he was as much a victim of his family's dysfunction as I was. He looked up at me with something approaching desperation. "Lauren, please, don't do this. We can fix everything if you'll just give us a chance." His plea was heartbreaking in its futility. There was no fixing a relationship built on deception, no repairing trust that had never actually existed. The only honest thing either of us could do was acknowledge that our marriage had been a business arrangement that was no longer serving either party's interests. "Goodbye, David," I said simply, leaning down to kiss his forehead with the same affection I might show a brother who'd disappointed me. "I hope you find whatever you're actually looking for in life." I gathered my purse and coat from the hall closet, nodding politely to the guests who were still processing everything they'd witnessed. Several people offered their business cards and expressed interest in future real estate opportunities, apparently impressed by my strategic thinking and financial acumen. As I reached the front door, I turned back for one last look at the Coleman family estate that had been my home away from home for 3 years. The house looked the same as it always had, elegant and imposing, but I now understood that appearances could be deceiving in the most fundamental ways. Patricia appeared in the doorway behind me, her composure finally cracking completely. "Lauren, please don't leave like this. We can work something out. We're family." Her desperate appeal to family loyalty was particularly ironic given that she'd spent the entire day demonstrating that I'd never been considered family in any meaningful sense. But I felt no satisfaction in her distress, only sadness that our relationship had always been built on such hollow foundations. "No, Patricia," I replied gently. "We were never family. We were business associates who pretended to have personal relationships for the sake of convenience. But I'm grateful for everything I've learned from knowing all of you." I walked out the front door and down the circular driveway toward my car, leaving behind 3 years of disappointment and self-doubt. The November air felt crisp and clean after the suffocating atmosphere of manipulation and desperation I'd just escaped. As I drove away from Maple Ridge Drive for the last time as a Coleman family member, I realized that today had given me something far more valuable than I'd lost. I'd finally learned my own worth, and more importantly, I'd learned to trust my instincts about people who saw me as a resource rather than a person. The woman who'd spent 3 years wondering why she couldn't earn acceptance from her husband's family was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that the right people would value her contributions without requiring proof of her worthiness. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter in my life, one where I wouldn't have to perform for approval or question my own perceptions about how I was being treated. The Coleman family had taught me lessons about manipulation and deception that would serve me well in future relationships, both personal and professional. As I checked into the Hartford Marriott that evening, I felt lighter than I had in years. The burden of trying to fit into a world that was determined to reject me had finally been lifted, and I was free to build relationships with people who actually wanted to know who I was rather than what I could do for them. The reckoning was complete, and for the first time in 3 years, I was exactly where I belonged. The Hartford Marriott felt like sanctuary after the suffocating atmosphere of manipulation I'd escaped at the Coleman estate. As I checked into my suite, the desk clerk's genuine professionalism stood in stark contrast to the calculated performances I'd endured all day. Her smile was authentic, her assistance motivated by service rather than hidden agendas. Such simple honesty felt revolutionary after 3 years of navigating relationships built on deception. I ordered room service and settled into the comfortable chair by the window, looking out at the city lights of downtown Hartford. My phone had been buzzing constantly since I'd left Maple Ridge Drive, but I'd ignored every call and text message. Whatever chaos I'd unleashed at that Thanksgiving table could wait until I'd processed my own emotions about everything that had transpired. The room service arrived with a perfectly prepared meal that I ate slowly, savoring both the food and the silence. No one was evaluating my table manners, questioning my menu choices, or making subtle comments about my background. I was simply a woman eating dinner in peace, free from the exhausting performance that had defined my existence as a Coleman family member. As I finished my meal, I finally allowed myself to examine my phone. The messages were exactly what I'd expected. David had sent 17 texts, ranging from desperate apologies to angry accusations. Patricia had left 3 voicemails that I deleted without listening to, knowing they would contain nothing but manipulation disguised as family concern. Even Melissa had reached out, apparently hoping I might reconsider my position if approached by a different family member. But there were also messages I hadn't anticipated. Judge Whitmore had sent a brief note expressing his admiration for my handling of what he called an impossible situation with remarkable dignity. 2 of the other dinner guests had reached out about potential business opportunities, clearly impressed by my strategic thinking and financial acumen. Most surprisingly, Victoria had called from Portland after receiving a detailed account of the day's events from someone who'd apparently been in contact with one of the dinner guests. I called Victoria back first, knowing she'd be waiting anxiously to hear my version of what had happened. Her phone rang once before she picked up, immediately launching into questions about my well-being and safety. "Lauren, are you okay? The story I heard sounds like something from a movie. Did you really own their house the entire time?" I filled Victoria in on the complete sequence of events, from the morning's false pleasantries through the final confrontation and my departure from the family estate. She listened without interruption, occasionally making soft sounds of amazement or disgust as I described the Coleman family's manipulation tactics. "I'm proud of you," Victoria said when I finished my account. 3 years ago, you would have written them a check just to avoid conflict. The woman who walked out of that house today is someone who knows her worth and won't accept less than she deserves." Her words resonated deeply because they captured something I'd been feeling but hadn't yet articulated. The person who'd married David Coleman had been seeking external validation, hoping that joining an established family would provide the sense of belonging she'd always craved. The woman who'd exposed their financial fraud at their own dinner table was someone who'd learned that belonging couldn't be purchased with money or earned through performance. We talked for over an hour about the practical implications of my decision to leave the marriage. Victoria offered to fly out immediately to provide support during what would undoubtedly be a difficult divorce process. She also mentioned that my business was strong enough to weather any financial disruption, and that several potential opportunities in Oregon might justify relocating back to Portland if I wanted distance from the Connecticut drama. After hanging up with Victoria, I took a long hot bath while considering my options for the future. The immediate priorities were clear: secure legal representation, establish temporary living arrangements, and begin the process of disentangling my life from the Coleman family's affairs. But beyond those logistics, I had the luxury of designing a completely new existence based on my own values, rather than someone else's expectations. The freedom was both exhilarating and intimidating. For 3 years, my social calendar had been dictated by Coleman family obligations. My wardrobe choices had been influenced by Patricia's subtle criticisms, and my business decisions had been filtered through considerations about how they might affect David's family relationships. Now I could make choices based purely on my own preferences and professional judgment. I was finally drifting off to sleep when my phone rang with a call from David. Against my better judgment, I answered, curious to hear what he might say when he couldn't rely on family pressure or social expectations to influence my response. "Lauren, thank God you picked up," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and what might have been tears. "We need to talk. Really talk, without all the family drama and financial pressure. Can you meet me somewhere neutral tomorrow morning?" The request was reasonable, and I'd known this conversation was inevitable. Despite everything that had happened, David deserved the opportunity to explain his perspective and perhaps find some path toward an amicable separation that would minimize damage to both our lives. "I can meet you for coffee at 10 o'clock at the Starbucks on Asylum Street," I said, choosing a public location where emotional manipulation would be more difficult. But I want to be clear that I'm not changing my mind about the divorce. This is about logistics and closure, not reconciliation. David agreed immediately, probably recognizing that any opportunity to speak with me was more than he had a right to expect after everything his family had done. We kept the conversation brief, both of us too emotionally drained for extended discussion about the wreckage of our marriage. The next morning, I dressed carefully in a navy business suit that projected professional confidence without suggesting either vulnerability or hostility. I arrived at Starbucks 10 minutes early, ordering my coffee and selecting a table where I could observe David's approach while maintaining enough privacy for serious conversation. He arrived precisely on time, looking haggard in a way I'd never seen before. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive clothes wrinkled as if he'd slept in them. The polished facade he'd maintained throughout our marriage had completely crumbled, revealing someone who looked lost and genuinely remorseful. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," David said as he sat down across from me. "I wasn't sure you'd ever speak to me again after yesterday." I studied his face, looking for signs of the calculated manipulation that had characterized our recent interactions. Instead, I saw exhaustion, embarrassment, and what appeared to be genuine regret about how our relationship had deteriorated. "I'm here because I think we both deserve clarity about how we got to this point," I replied. "And because I'd prefer to handle our separation with dignity, rather than through attorneys and court battles." David nodded gratefully, apparently recognizing that my willingness to have this conversation was more generous than he had any right to expect. He took a sip of his coffee before launching into what was clearly a prepared statement about his family's behavior and his role in enabling their treatment of me. "Lauren, I need you to know that I never intended for things to go this far," he began. When my parents first suggested that you might be able to help with some temporary financial difficulties, I thought it was a reasonable request between family members. I didn't realize they were planning such an elaborate manipulation campaign. His explanation was probably sincere, but it revealed the fundamental weakness in his character that had enabled his family's behavior throughout our marriage. David had consistently chosen the path of least resistance, avoiding conflict with his parents while allowing them to treat me with increasing disrespect and hostility. David, the financial manipulation was just the final chapter in 3 years of systematic exclusion and condescension, I said gently. Your family made it clear from our first meeting that I wasn't good enough for their world, and you never once defended me or challenged their behavior. He looked genuinely pained by my assessment, but couldn't deny its accuracy. I thought if I just gave them time to get to know you, they'd come around. I didn't want to create family conflicts that would make everyone uncomfortable. The irony of his concern about family comfort was striking, given that he'd allowed me to be uncomfortable for 3 years while hoping his parents would spontaneously develop appreciation for my character. His conflict avoidance had enabled their manipulation while leaving me isolated and defensive. The problem wasn't that your family didn't know me, David, I explained. The problem was that they saw me as a resource rather than a person. And you were so focused on maintaining family harmony that you never recognized how their behavior was affecting our marriage. We talked for nearly 2 hours about the patterns that had developed in our relationship, the warning signs we'd both ignored, and the fundamental incompatibilities that had been masked by financial considerations and social expectations. David seemed genuinely surprised by some of my observations about his family's treatment of me, as if he'd been so focused on managing their demands that he'd never considered my perspective on their behavior. The most revealing moment came when I asked him directly about his motivations for pursuing our relationship initially. David struggled with the question for several minutes before admitting that his attraction to me had been influenced by my professional success and financial independence. I did love you, he said finally, but I also saw how successful you were, how good you were at solving problems and managing complex situations. When my family started having financial difficulties, I thought your expertise could help us find solutions. His honesty was both painful and liberating. David had loved me, but he'd also seen me as a potential solution to his family's problems. The combination of genuine affection and calculated opportunism had created a relationship built on fundamentally unstable foundations. I appreciate your honesty, I said, meaning it sincerely, and I want you to know that I don't hate you or your family. I'm disappointed and hurt, but I understand that desperation makes people do things they wouldn't normally consider. David looked surprised by my lack of bitterness, apparently having expected accusations and recriminations rather than measured analysis of our failed relationship. But anger would have been counterproductive at this point. I needed closure and clarity, not emotional satisfaction from punishing someone who was already suffering the consequences of his choices. We spent the remainder of our conversation discussing practical matters related to our separation. I would file for divorce on grounds of irreconcilable differences, seeking only my personal property and business assets while making no claim on Coleman family holdings. David would have 90 days to remove his belongings from our West Hartford condo, which I would be keeping since I'd purchased it with my own funds. Most importantly, we agreed that any public statements about our divorce would emphasize mutual respect and different life goals, rather than the financial manipulation that had precipitated our separation. This approach would minimize damage to both our reputations while allowing us to move forward with dignity intact. As we prepared to leave Starbucks, David made one final attempt to salvage something from our relationship. Lauren, I know I don't deserve to ask this, but is there any possibility that we could remain friends? I've learned more about myself in the past 24 hours than in the previous 3 years, and I'd hate to lose your wisdom and perspective completely. His request was touching in its sincerity, and I found myself genuinely considering whether friendship might be possible once we'd processed the pain of our failed marriage. David had significant character flaws, but he wasn't malicious in the way his parents had been. He was weak and conflict avoidant, but he seemed capable of learning from his mistakes. Ask me again in 6 months, I said finally. After we've both had time to heal from this and figure out who we are as individuals rather than as part of a dysfunctional family system. David accepted my conditional response with more grace than I'd expected, apparently recognizing that any possibility of future friendship was more than he had a right to hope for, given the circumstances of our separation. I spent the following weeks establishing my new independent life with the same methodical approach I'd always brought to business challenges. I hired Catherine Reed, one of Hartford's most respected family law attorneys, to handle my divorce proceedings. Catherine was impressed by the documentation I'd gathered about the Coleman family's financial situation and assured me that my assets would be completely protected throughout the process. Finding a new place to live took longer than I'd expected, partly because I'd become quite particular about the energy and atmosphere of potential homes. After 3 years in spaces that had been designed to impress others rather than provide comfort, I wanted a place that reflected my actual personality and preferences, rather than some idealized version of Connecticut sophistication. I eventually found a stunning modern townhouse in downtown Hartford that had been converted from a historic brick warehouse. The space featured exposed brick walls, soaring ceilings, and floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the interior with natural light. The industrial aesthetic appealed to my background in renovation and restoration, while the downtown location provided access to restaurants, cultural venues, and professional opportunities that I'd been missing during my suburban exile. More importantly, the space felt authentically mine in a way that nowhere had since I'd left Portland. I could display my own artwork without worrying about whether it complemented someone else's decorating scheme, play my music without considering whether neighbors would approve, and invite guests based on genuine friendship rather than social obligation. The transition wasn't without challenges. Several of my Connecticut business contacts were connected to the Coleman family's social circle, and I had to navigate carefully to maintain professional relationships while extracting myself from personal drama. Some people chose sides, either supporting my decision to leave an obviously dysfunctional situation or expressing disappointment that I hadn't tried harder to preserve my marriage. But I was surprised by how many people expressed private relief that I'd finally escaped what they'd recognized as an unhealthy dynamic. Judge Whitmore invited me to lunch and shared his long-standing concerns about the Coleman family's financial management and treatment of outsiders. Several other prominent Hartford residents reached out with business opportunities and social invitations that had nothing to do with my former married status. Most gratifying were the opportunities that emerged for my real estate business. The strategic thinking I demonstrated during my confrontation with the Coleman family had impressed several potential investors who were looking for partners with my combination of financial acumen and renovation expertise. I found myself busier than ever with projects that challenged my skills while generating substantial profits. The divorce proceedings concluded more smoothly than I'd dared to hope. The Coleman family was too focused on their own financial survival to contest my property claims, especially since Catherine had made it clear that any extended litigation would result in public disclosure of their fraudulent financial practices. They accepted my generous settlement terms without argument, apparently grateful that I wasn't seeking punitive damages for their attempted manipulation. 6 months after that devastating Thanksgiving dinner, I received a call from David asking if I was ready to consider the friendship conversation we'd postponed. He sounded different on the phone, more mature and self-aware than the man I'd divorced. He'd apparently spent considerable time in therapy working through his relationship patterns and family dynamics. We met for lunch at a neutral restaurant downtown, and I was impressed by the changes in his demeanor and perspective. David had taken responsibility for his role in enabling his family's dysfunction, and he'd established much firmer boundaries with his parents about financial and personal matters. He seemed genuinely interested in my well-being, rather than what I might be able to do for him. The conversation was pleasant, but not particularly deep, confirming my sense that we'd been better as business associates than as romantic partners. We agreed to maintain occasional contact as friendly acquaintances, the kind of relationship that might develop into something more meaningful over time if both parties remained interested. More significantly, David shared that his family had been forced to make dramatic changes in their lifestyle and expectations. Patricia and Frank had sold most of their remaining assets to pay off debts and were now living in a modest apartment in West Hartford. Patricia had taken a job at an upscale boutique, while Frank was working as a consultant for a financial planning firm that specialized in helping families recover from bankruptcy. The Coleman children had also been forced to adjust their expectations about inheritance and family support. Melissa's husband had found steady employment after years of depending on family resources, while Ryan had moved to Boston to pursue opportunities in technology rather than relying on the family business. David himself had left the investment firm and was working for a nonprofit organization that provided financial literacy education to low-income families. The career change had reduced his income significantly, but he seemed happier and more purposeful than he'd ever been during our marriage. The changes in the Coleman family dynamics were dramatic enough to suggest that my confrontation at Thanksgiving dinner had been a catalyst for positive transformation rather than just destructive exposure. Sometimes people needed to hit bottom before they could begin building healthier patterns of behavior. As for my own life, the year following my divorce had been the most professionally successful and personally fulfilling period I'd experienced since leaving Portland. My business was thriving with a portfolio of projects that challenged my skills while generating substantial profits. I developed friendships based on mutual interests and respect, rather than social positioning or family obligations. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my instincts about people and situations, rather than second-guessing my perceptions when they conflicted with social expectations. The woman who'd spent 3 years wondering why she couldn't earn acceptance from her husband's family had been replaced by someone who understood that the right people would value her contributions without requiring proof of worthiness. I'd also begun dating again, carefully and selectively, with a much clearer understanding of what I wanted in a partner. The men I met were evaluated based on their character and compatibility rather than their family background or social connections. It was remarkable how much easier relationships became when both parties were genuinely interested in knowing each other as individuals rather than as representatives of particular social or economic classes. On the first anniversary of that catastrophic Thanksgiving dinner, I hosted my own celebration in my downtown townhouse. The guest list included Victoria, who'd flown out from Portland, along with several Hartford friends I'd made since my divorce. The conversation was lively and genuine, filled with the kind of laughter and connection I'd been seeking throughout my marriage to David. As we sat around my dining room table, sharing stories and enjoying the meal I'd prepared without any pressure to impress or conform to someone else's standards, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that moment when Patricia had called me worthless in front of 23 witnesses. Her cruel comment had been intended to diminish my sense of self-worth and make me more susceptible to their financial manipulation. Instead, it had forced me to examine the true nature of our relationships and recognize that I'd been accepting treatment that was completely inconsistent with my actual value as a person and professional. The revelation that I owned the house where she'd delivered that insult had been satisfying in the moment, but the real victory had been walking away from a situation that was never going to improve, regardless of how much money I might have provided, or how perfectly I might have performed the role of grateful daughter-in-law. As my dinner guests raised their glasses to toast friendship and new beginnings, I realized that Patricia had been wrong about more than just my financial situation. I wasn't worthless, and I never had been. I was someone who'd temporarily lost sight of her own value while trying to earn acceptance from people who'd never been worthy of her efforts. The house she'd tried to use as a symbol of my exclusion had become a symbol of my strength and independence. The family she'd presented as my social superiors had revealed themselves to be desperate frauds who'd never deserved the respect I'd offered them. But most importantly, the woman she'd tried to shame into submission had discovered her own power and learned to use it with wisdom and integrity. That transformation was worth far more than any amount of money I might have lost, or any social connections I might have sacrificed. As the evening wound down and my guests prepared to leave, Victoria pulled me aside for a private conversation about my plans for the future. She'd been impressed by the changes in my confidence and perspective, and she wanted to discuss some exciting business opportunities that would allow us to expand our partnership into new markets. "The woman I met tonight is someone I'd follow into any business venture," Victoria said with characteristic directness. "You've learned lessons about leadership and strategic thinking that most people never master. Whatever you decide to do next, I want to be part of it." Her confidence in my abilities was gratifying, but more importantly, it confirmed that my professional reputation had survived the personal drama of my divorce. If anything, the strategic thinking I'd demonstrated in handling the Coleman family crisis had enhanced my standing in the business community. As I cleaned up after the dinner party, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for everything that had led me to this moment. The pain and humiliation of my failed marriage had been necessary experiences that taught me to recognize my worth and demand appropriate treatment from everyone in my life. The woman who'd walked out of the Coleman estate that Thanksgiving evening had been afraid of losing her place in a world that had never truly welcomed her. The woman who'd hosted tonight's celebration understood that she could create her own world, filled with people who genuinely appreciated her character and contributions. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been essential. Sometimes the most valuable gifts come disguised as devastating losses, and sometimes the people who hurt us most are actually teaching us lessons we desperately needed to learn. As I turned off the lights in my townhouse and prepared for bed, I realized that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not because of what I'd lost, but because of what I'd found. The courage to value myself enough to walk away from situations that diminished my spirit, and the wisdom to recognize that true belonging couldn't be purchased or performed but only discovered through authentic relationships built on mutual respect and genuine affection. The worthless daughter-in-law Patricia had tried to create had never existed. In her place was a woman who understood her value and wouldn't accept anything less than she deserved. That woman had a bright future ahead of her, filled with possibilities that the frightened, insecure person from 3 years ago couldn't have imagined. The reckoning was complete, and the liberation was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.